The first thing you need to understand is that nobody took us seriously. Not even a little. I've been trying to figure out how to tell this story for 3 years now. Every time I sit down to write it, I end up staring at the wall for an hour, thinking about that moment, that specific moment, when Admiral Veth Kara of the Dominion's 7th Expeditionary Fleet sent his transmission to the council chambers on Veloris Prime. I watched that transmission live. I was 26 years old, sitting in a break room at DRSF Outpost Keller 9 on the edge of the Kuiper Belt, eating a cold sandwich, and I heard an entire alien civilization laugh at us. Not metaphorically, literally they laughed. The translation software rendered it as a kind of low, resonant clicking. Their version of laughter apparently involved something between a cough and a purr, but the sentiment was unmistakable. The Universal Congress translation team later confirmed it. They were laughing at us, at the idea of us. I remember setting down my sandwich. I remember thinking, they have no idea. Let me back up, way back, because to understand what happened in the Cassini corridor in the spring of 2189, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand what it felt like to be human in those years, that strange, electric, terrifying window between first contact and first conflict. That period that historians now call the interstitial decade, though nobody called it that at the time. At the time, most of us just called it the waiting. First contact happened in 2179. I was 16. It's one of those moments, like the big ones in your grandparents' stories, where everyone remembers exactly where they were. I was in my parents' kitchen in Christchurch, New Zealand, watching the rain hit the window, pretending to do homework when my mother came running in from the living room with her hand over her mouth. "They found something," she said, "or something found us." The signal had come from beyond the heliopause, a structured, mathematical pulse, prime number sequences interspersed with what linguists would later identify as greeting protocols. Clean, deliberate, patient, almost like whoever sent it had been sending it for a long time and was used to waiting. The world didn't end. That's the first thing to say. People expected panic. Films had been predicting panic for a century, but mostly what happened was a kind of stunned, collective exhale. Like humanity had been holding its breath for millennia without knowing it, and finally, it could let go. Then came the years of translation. The years of math-first communication. The years of slowly, painstakingly building a common language out of physics constants and geometric proofs. The Galactic Council, which turned out to be a governing body of 11 recognized species spanning roughly 400 light-years, was patient with us. Politely patient. The way you're patient with a child who's trying to tie their own shoes for the first time. That patience, we would later understand, was not kindness. It was assessment. They were watching us, learning us, measuring us. And by 2184, they had made their assessment. The official council communiqué was diplomatic in its phrasing. It used words like developmental asymmetry and resource allocation concerns, and territorial governance frameworks. My colleague Dr. Priya Anand, who was part of the translation team at the time and is now one of my closest friends, told me that the raw linguistic content, stripped of its diplomatic gloss, was considerably more blunt. What the council was actually saying in their own language was something closer to, "You are primitive, your space is valuable, and we are deciding what to do about that." Humanity's response to this, and I say this with genuine affection for our species, was absolutely characteristic. We started building. You have to understand the political landscape of Earth in 2184 to appreciate what happened next. We weren't a unified planet. We'd been working toward unified planetary governance since first contact. The UN had expanded enormously. The Earth Defense Coordination Authority had been established. Most of the major nation-states had signed the Geneva Space Accords. But we were still, fundamentally, a fractious, argumentative, brilliant, stubborn collection of humans who couldn't agree on what to have for lunch. let alone how to respond to an existential geopolitical threat from outer space. Which, again, characteristic. And in this case, accidentally genius. Because what happened when humanity realized the Council might not have our best interests at heart wasn't a single coordinated defense plan. It was dozens of defense plans, running simultaneously, competing with each other, stealing each other's best ideas, and producing, through that messy, infuriating, quintessentially human process of argument and improvisation, something that no single coordinated body could have designed. The Americans had their program, the Chinese had theirs, the ESA had 3 separate ones that kept merging and splitting. The Indian Space Defense Initiative was working on something that officially didn't exist yet. Russia, Brazil, Nigeria, Japan, Australia, all of them. And then the private sector. God help us, the private sector. 17 different defense contractors, 4 of them operating out of orbital stations that existed in genuinely ambiguous jurisdictional territory, all of them racing each other and the governments and occasionally their own previous selves. It was chaos. It was glorious. And somewhere in the middle of all that glorious chaos, a materials engineer named Yusuf Ademi at a facility in the Nigerian Space Authority's Advanced Research Wing wrote a 17-page paper that most of his colleagues dismissed as theoretical wishful thinking, titled Electromagnetic Acceleration Arrays in Vacuum Environments, Practical Applications for Deep Space Ordnance Delivery. A railgun paper for space. Nobody laughed at Yusuf at the time, or if they did, they were quiet about it. The idea wasn't new. Rail-based electromagnetic acceleration had been theoretical military technology for decades, and the U.S. Navy had been experimenting with atmospheric versions since before I was born. The problem had always been the same: power requirements, barrel degradation, projectile stability. In atmosphere, the engineering challenges were immense. The projectiles experienced drag. The barrels wore out. The power draw was extraordinary. In space, Yusuf pointed out, 2 of those 3 problems essentially disappeared. No atmosphere meant no drag. The projectile, once launched, would continue accelerating to its terminal velocity and maintain it indefinitely. And while barrel degradation was still a factor, the thermal management problem in vacuum was actually more tractable than in air, different, but more tractable. That left power. Power was the problem that consumed the next 4 years. I won't pretend I understand the full engineering history, because I don't. I'm a military historian, not a physicist, and the people who actually solved the power problem are smarter than I'll ever be. But the short version is this. The breakthrough came not from any single innovation, but from the collision of 3 separate research streams. Fusion miniaturization work out of MIT. Superconductor cooling research from a joint ESA-Chinese program in orbit around Jupiter. And a completely unexpected contribution from the private sector. Specifically, a small company in Singapore that had been working on high-density capacitor arrays for deep space communication relays and discovered, almost by accident, that their charging and discharge architecture scaled in ways nobody had anticipated. Put those 3 things together, and you had a power solution. Put a power solution with Yusuf's vacuum acceleration math, and you had something that didn't have a name yet. By 2187, they were calling it Project Stormwall. By 2188, the first operational unit was installed at Keller 9, which is how I ended up eating a cold sandwich there when the Council's laughter came through on the deep space relay. I should tell you what Keller 9 looked like, because the image matters. It was a station, technically a deep space research and defense coordination outpost, which was bureaucratic language for "we built a thing out here, and we're not entirely sure what to do with it yet." It sat at the inner edge of the Kuiper Belt, which meant it was roughly 42 AU from the Sun, far enough that the Sun was just a very bright star, close enough that supply runs were still feasible with our current propulsion technology. The station was ugly in the way that functional things are often ugly: modular, rectangular. It had been assembled over 18 months from prefabricated sections, and you could tell the joints between sections weren't always perfectly aligned, and there was a stretch of corridor near the engineering bay where the floor panels were 3 different shades of gray because they'd run out of the original color and had to use whatever was in stock. The crew was about 200 people: scientists, engineers, defense personnel, logistics staff. The kind of cross-disciplinary mix that sounds great on paper and in practice means that every team meeting involves at least one argument about terminology. And attached to the station's outer hull, attached in the way that a cathedral is attached to the village that built it, in the sense that it was clearly the point of the whole enterprise, was Stormwall Unit 1. It was enormous. That's what people don't always grasp from the technical specifications. The specifications give you numbers: barrel length 2.4 kilometers, bore diameter 43 centimeters, rated muzzle velocity 15 kilometers per second. But numbers don't convey the experience of standing in the observation bay and looking at it through the reinforced viewport. The barrel extended from the station's forward axis like a pointing finger, or like a declaration. It was made of a composite material that I couldn't name if my life depended on it, wrapped in cooling elements that glittered faintly in the far sunlight. At maximum charge, the capacitor banks along its length lit up in a sequence, a slow pulse moving from breech to muzzle, that the engineering team called the wave, and that I thought looked like something breathing. The projectiles were tungsten carbide alloy cylinders, about 60 centimeters long and 15 wide, machined to tolerances that the lead engineer, a woman named Commander Saoirse Walsh, described as tolerances that would give a Swiss watchmaker anxiety. At 15 kilometers per second, one of those cylinders carried kinetic energy roughly equivalent to a small nuclear weapon, without the blast radius, without the radiation, without any of the geopolitical complications of nuclear weaponry. Just mass and velocity and the pure, elegant physics of force equals mass times acceleration applied at a scale that made people uncomfortable to think about. Saoirse once described it to me over dinner as the most honest weapon ever made. "It doesn't pretend," she said, cutting her food methodically. "It doesn't have a complicated delivery system or a timer or a yield calculation. You put it somewhere at high speed and something happens. That's it. That's the whole thing." "That sounds like a description of a rock," I said. She pointed at me with her fork. "Exactly." By the time the Council's transmission arrived, there were 7 operational Stormwall units. Keller 9 had Unit 1. 3 more were attached to repurposed mining platforms in the asteroid belt. 2 were installed on the moons of Jupiter. Ganymede had 1, Callisto had 1, and Unit 7 was under construction at a classified location that I'm still not cleared to name, though at this point I think everyone has a reasonable guess. The Council didn't know about any of them. That wasn't accidental. The Earth Defense Coordination Authority had been very deliberate about this, careful about what we showed the Council's observation satellites, careful about the language used in official communications, careful to discuss our planetary defense research in terms that were technically accurate but strategically incomplete. We talked about kinetic interceptor research. We talked about asteroid deflection systems. Both of those things were true. They were just not the whole truth. Looking back, I think the Council's analysts should have been more suspicious of those terms. Asteroid deflection is a reasonable cover for exactly the technology profile that Stormwall represented. If they'd been paying closer attention, if they'd been taking us seriously enough to pay closer attention, they might have asked harder questions. Instead, they were laughing. The transmission came through at approximately 1400 hours Keller 9 station time, which meant late morning in the Council's formal session cycle. Admiral Veth Kara, whose species, the Velhari, I should explain, look approximately like a six-legged deer, crossed with something that has too many eyes, was presenting to the full council assembly. The content of his presentation was a proposed framework for provisional territorial reallocation of the Sol system, which meant, in plain language, that he was telling the 11 species of the Galactic Council that they should carve up our solar system and decide who got which parts. Earth would get to keep Earth. That was the generous part. Mars, the asteroid belt, the gas giants, the Kuiper belt, and everything beyond, those would be subject to joint governance frameworks that would, in practice, mean council member species moving in and doing whatever they wanted. I remember reading the translation on my tablet. I remember the particular quality of stillness in the break room as about a dozen of us who had seen the same text sat very quietly, not looking at each other. Then someone, I think it was a technician named Marcus, a big, soft-spoken man from Sao Paulo who was usually very calm, said, "Oh, that's interesting." The tone he used was the tone of a man who has just found out that someone has put a hand on his chest to push him back. And then the council's recording continued. Because the council session was a live relay and we were getting it all, not just the parts the EDCA wanted us to see. And the recording showed what happened after Vethkara's proposal, which was that two of the other council members, ambassadors representing the Shorath Cooperative and the Trellian Hegemony, asked a question. They asked about human defensive capability. Specifically, they asked whether the humans posed any meaningful military risk to a Dominion fleet. And Vethkara laughed. The clicking purring sound that the translation software rendered, a little inadequately, as laughter. He said, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, though the official transcript is available in the archive, that the humans had chemical propulsion, pre-adolescent energy weapons research, and primitive kinetic impact concepts. He said that their most advanced vessels were resource extraction platforms modified for defensive pretense. He said that a single Dominion battle group could pacify Earth's defense perimeter in a single operational rotation, which translated to something between 30 and 60 of their hours. Then he said, and this part I remember exactly, because I've heard the translation so many times that it's engraved in the inside of my skull. The humans are fascinating in their ambition and touching in their certainty. But they are not a military consideration. The council laughed, all 11 species, the great clicking, purring, humming, resonating laughter of 11 alien civilizations, echoing through a relay station at the edge of the Kuiper Belt, received by a room full of humans eating cold sandwiches. I picked mine back up and finished it. Because here's the thing that I want you to understand. We were counting on them to think exactly that. The weeks after the transmission were the most tightly controlled period of organized human anxiety I've ever witnessed. The EDCA went to maximum operational security. Fleet Admiral Dominica Okafor, who had been running the Defense Coordination Program since its founding, and who I would later have the privilege of interviewing for this account, convened an emergency session that lasted 4 days. I wasn't in that session. My access level didn't cover it, but I've since spoken to 3 people who were, and the picture they paint is consistent. The question wasn't whether the Dominion would act. Vethkara's proposal had been received by the full council, and the vote to approve it had passed 7-4, 4 dissenters, interestingly, but still a majority. The question was when, and with what force, and whether the timeline the EDCA had been working toward was going to hold. The timeline, that's the key word. Project Stormwall had always been designed around a specific window. The units took time to build. The crew training took time. The targeting systems, the fire control integration, the communications architecture that let units coordinate across astronomical distances, all of it took time. The EDCA's planning assumption had been that the Council would take 2 to 3 years to move from declaration to deployment. The vote accelerated that, not catastrophically, but enough that some things that had been scheduled for completion in 2190 were suddenly needed in 2189. Which meant that, when the Dominion's first expeditionary fleet began its transit toward the Sol system in the winter of 2188, they were moving towards something that was not quite ready. Not quite. I want to take a moment here to talk about Commander Saoirse Walsh, because she matters to this story in ways that the official histories don't always capture. I mentioned her earlier, the engineer who described railguns as honest weapons. She was the commanding officer of Keller 9, which officially made her a research station commander, but practically made her the woman responsible for Unit 1, the first Stormwall installation, and for the crew of 200 people who lived and worked on a frozen outpost at the edge of the solar system with an extremely large and extremely powerful weapon attached to their front door. She was from Galway, originally, though she'd spent most of her adult life off-world, and had the slightly loose relationship with gravity that long-term space residents tend to develop. She walked with a deliberate flatness to her step that grounded her gently rather than confidently, conserving momentum the way you learn to when your environment can't be trusted to hold you down. She had red hair going gray at the temples, which she kept in a functional braid that was always slightly fraying by the end of a shift. She had a habit of pausing mid-sentence to think, not because she was slow, but because she was precise, and she wouldn't say a thing until she had the right words for it. I talked to her for many hours while preparing this account, and the thing I keep coming back to is something she said near the end of our last conversation, about what it was like in those weeks after the Council vote, waiting. The worst part wasn't the fear, she said, though there was fear. The worst part was knowing that everything we were doing, all of this preparation, all of these years, it was all built on a bet. We were betting that what we'd built was enough, and we wouldn't know if we'd won the bet until someone called it. She paused, looked out the window. I spent a lot of time during those weeks standing at the viewport looking at Unit 1, she said, just looking at it, trying to decide if I believed in it. Did you? I asked. She smiled very slightly. Ask me again after the next part of the story, she said. The Dominion's first expeditionary fleet was not subtle about its approach. Later analysis suggests this was deliberate, a calculated display of strength, intended to give humanity time to see them coming and come to the appropriate conclusions about resistance. The fleet made no attempt to use the indirect transit corridors that would have brought them in from the system's edge with minimal sensor exposure. They came in along the ecliptic, straight and clean, broadcasting Dominion fleet identification codes in the clear. They wanted to be seen. They were seen. EDCA, Deep Space Monitoring, picked them up approximately 8 months before their projected arrival at the Earth-Moon system. Their fleet configuration, which our analysts studied obsessively for those 8 months, was what the Dominion called a pacification array. 15 vessels in total, 1 command cruiser, which was roughly the size and armament profile of a mid-sized aircraft carrier if the carrier also had energy weapons that could vaporize a small mountain, 4 destroyer-class escorts, 8 troop transport vessels, because apparently the Dominion's operational plan involved ground presence in addition to orbital bombardment, and 2 support ships carrying, according to intercepted logistical data, enough supplies for a 6-month occupation. 15 ships, 8 months out. Saoirse spent those 8 months in a state that her crew described, with affection and a little apprehension, as focused. She ran drills. She refined targeting calculations. She worked with the fire control teams on Unit 1 and the fire control teams at every other Stormwall installation through quantum-encrypted relay, running scenario after scenario, adjusting variables, finding the problems before they became problems. She slept 4 hours a night and ate at her workstation, and did not, By all accounts, once in those 8 months expressed doubt about the outcome in front of her crew. I couldn't, she told me. I knew what doubt would do to them, and they needed to believe in this, because I needed them to believe in it. If they weren't operating from belief, they were operating from fear, and fear makes you slow. Marcus, the soft-spoken technician from Sao Paulo who had been in the break room during the transmission, told me a slightly different story. He said that sometimes, late in the station's simulated night cycle, he would walk past Saoirse's office and see her light still on, and through the window in the door he would see her sitting very still at her desk, not working, just sitting, with the expression of someone who was doing math in their head that they desperately wanted to come out to a different answer. She was scared, he told me. She was terrified, she just wouldn't let it stop her. That, to me, is the most human thing I've ever heard about the whole affair. 4 months before the Dominion fleet's arrival, they sent a transmission. This one wasn't to the Council. It was to Earth directly in a language that our translation protocols had been decoding for years. Admiral Vethkara again, this time not laughing. This time formal, measured in the careful register that their culture used for what might be translated as official announcement to a subordinate party. The transmission informed Earth that the Galactic Council had approved provisional territorial reallocation of the Sol system. It informed Earth that the Dominion's first expeditionary fleet was arriving to facilitate an orderly transition. It invited Earth's government to prepare a formal instrument of acknowledgement of Council authority to be presented upon the fleet's arrival at the inner system. It did not ask for a response. Earth's government gave one anyway. The response, drafted by Fleet Admiral Okafor in consultation with the Security Council and approved in an emergency session of the expanded UN General Assembly, was 600 words long. I've read it many times. It's a remarkable document, calm, specific, and with a particular quality that I can only describe as load-bearing restraint. It didn't bluster. It didn't threaten. It didn't notably say that we had anything that could stop them. What it said essentially was this: we are aware of your fleet's approach. We note the Council's decision. We have not agreed to it. We suggest you reconsider. We suggest you reconsider. 6 words, somewhere in the middle of a diplomatic document that managed to carry about 40 years of human engineering in their implication. Vethkara's fleet, we later learned, received this response and characteristically did not reconsider. They kept coming. The last month before arrival. I want to try to capture what that felt like on Keller 9, because I was there, and because the official histories tend to focus on the tactical decisions and miss the texture of living through it. It felt like the last week before a storm that you've been watching build for a long time. You've done everything you can do. You've boarded the windows and stocked the supplies and tied down everything that might blow away. Now there's nothing left to do but wait, and the waiting has a particular quality, very quiet, very focused, each action precise and deliberate, because deliberately precise actions are the one thing you can still control. People got very kind to each other. I noticed this. The small frictions that are inevitable on a station with 200 people living in close quarters, the arguments about noise and meal schedules and whose turn it was to run the inventory check, they just stopped. Not because people were hiding feelings, but because they'd sorted through their priorities and found that those things weren't on the list. People talked to their families more. The communication queue, our quantum relay, had limited bandwidth for personal communications, so messages were scheduled and throttled was always full. I sent messages to my mother in Christchurch, to my sister in Auckland. Long ones, not the usual quick check-ins. My mother, who understood more than she let on about what I was doing and where, sent back messages that were very carefully cheerful, which was its own kind of love. Marcus started keeping a journal. He told me later that he'd never kept a journal before in his life, but something made him want to write things down. I don't know, he said. I wanted there to be a record, just in case the record was important. Saoirse ran a full system diagnostic on Unit 1 that took 3 days. Then she ran it again. When her deputy engineer gently pointed out that they'd already done it twice, she said, "We're doing it a third time." They found one minor calibration drift in the electromagnetic sequencing array. It wouldn't have affected performance significantly. She fixed it anyway. "If it can be perfect," she told her deputy, "it should be perfect." The fleet arrived at the outer system on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically Tuesday because there's something absurd about it, something almost comic about the fact that one of the most significant moments in human history fell on a Tuesday afternoon, while people were finishing their lunches and updating their shift logs. The Dominion fleet came through the heliopause at 13:23 hours Keller 9 station time, decelerating from their interstellar transit velocity to in-system approach speed. Deceleration took them 2 days, during which our tracking systems updated their position projections every 4 hours, and the information was relayed to all 7 Stormwall installations, to Fleet Command on Earth, to the EDCA's War Council, and to the observation team I was part of on Keller 9. 15 ships, right on schedule, right on the trajectory the models had predicted. They crossed the heliopause at approximately 120 AU from the Sun. Their projected track brought them through the Kuiper Belt, through our region, in approximately 36 hours. Their ultimate destination was Earth orbit, where they intended to establish a command position and receive humanity's formal capitulation. They had not contacted us again since the initial transmission. They were not expecting a fight. I want to pause here because I think this is important. I've spent 3 years trying to understand the Dominion's decision-making in this period, and I've come to believe that their failure wasn't military. It wasn't a matter of underestimating our weapons technology, though they certainly did that. Their failure was conceptual. They did not understand what they were looking at because they had decided in advance that they already knew. They looked at humanity, and they saw a primitive species. And once you've decided that, once you've filed it and settled it in your mind, you stop looking. You stop asking questions. You stop examining the data with fresh eyes because you already know the answer. They knew that humans had chemical rockets and preliminary energy research and primitive kinetic impact concepts. They did not know that the Kuiper Belt, which they were about to transit, was not empty. The order to go to full readiness came from Fleet Admiral Acaffer at 600 hours on the day. The Dominion fleet was projected to cross 50 AU. On Keller 9, full readiness meant specific things. It meant the capacitor banks on Unit 1 going to charging cycle, a process that took 4 hours and produced a low, persistent vibration through the station's hull that you could feel through the soles of your boots. It meant the fire control team taking their positions in the targeting bay, which was a room I will never forget. A long, dim space lit mostly by screens, with 7 people seated at workstations and Saoirse standing at the back watching them, her arms folded, that fraying braid having lost its fight with gravity about 3 hours into the shift. It meant that every person on the station knew, in that specific, bone-deep way that you know things when they stop being theoretical, that it was happening. Marcus came to find me about an hour into the charge cycle. He'd been running a diagnostic on the communications relay, and he wasn't needed for anything in particular for the next 2 hours. He sat down next to me in the observation bay, where I had a clear view of Unit 1's barrel extending into the black. "You nervous?" he said. "Extremely," I said. "Good," he said. "That means you're paying attention." We sat there in silence for a while, watching the capacitor elements along Unit 1's length begin their slow pulse, the wave, as the engineers called it, moving from breech to muzzle, again and again, building toward the charge that would be needed. "Do you think it'll work?" Marcus asked. I thought about Saoirse standing at the viewport, doing math she wanted to come out differently. "Yes," I said. "I meant it." Part 2, The Disappearance. At 11:47 hours, the Dominion fleet crossed 50 AU. At that range, the targeting system on Unit 1 and on every other Stormwall installation in the network had a firing solution. Not a good one yet. Not the clean, high-confidence solution that the targeting algorithms were designed to wait for, but a solution. The computers were tracking all 15 ships, updating positions every 11 seconds based on sensor data from a distributed network of deep space monitoring buoys that we'd spent 3 years deploying in what was officially described as a Kuiper Belt Scientific Survey program. Another technically accurate strategic misdirection. I was in the targeting bay by this point, standing against the back wall next to a lieutenant named Chen who was part of the communications team. We were quiet. Everyone was quiet. The only sounds were the soft processing sounds of the workstations and the distant, structural vibration of the charging capacitors. Saoirse was standing very still in the center of the bay, watching the main display. The main display showed the Dominion fleet as a cluster of 15 light blue indicators moving slowly at this scale, slowly, across a coordinate grid. Our installations were shown as orange markers. Keller 9 was closest to the fleet's projected track. We would have firing solutions first. We would fire first. The targeting system had been programmed with a specific engagement sequence, and I want to explain this carefully because it's central to understanding what happened. The Dominion's fleet was configured for psychological impact. The command cruiser, the largest, most visually imposing vessel, was in front. The destroyer escorts were arranged in a diamond formation around and behind it. The troop transports were in a loose cluster in the middle. The support ships were at the rear. Human tactical doctrine, shaped by that messy, arguing, improvisational process I described earlier, had looked at this configuration and come to an interesting conclusion. Don't shoot the command cruiser first. Shoot the destroyers. The logic, which I've since discussed with several of the planners involved, was this. The command cruiser was the psychological center of the fleet, but the destroyers were the operational capability. Destroy the destroyers first, and you remove the fleet's offensive and defensive capability. The command cruiser becomes a very expensive empty gesture. The troop transports become irrelevant. The support ships become fuel and supplies waiting to be abandoned. And there was another consideration, more subtle and in some ways more important. Shooting the command cruiser first, killing the admiral first, invites escalation. It's a decapitation strike, and decapitation strikes in human military history had a way of creating martyrs and hardening resolve. The Dominion had pride. The Dominion had hierarchy and honor codes that our analysts had spent years studying. Killing Veth Kara in the first volley would turn him into something, a symbol, a justification for total war. Destroy his fleet around him, on the other hand. Leave him alive and in command of nothing. Let him be the one who had to transmit back to the council what had happened. That was the plan. The targeting computers reached 94% confidence solution at 12:03 hours. Standard EDCA protocol was to engage at 95%. The next 47 seconds were the quietest I have ever experienced. The kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses on you. I remember looking at the targeting display. I remember looking at Saoirse's back. I remember thinking, with the strange irrelevance that your mind produces in extremis, that her braid was more frayed than usual. At 12:03 hours and 47 seconds, the targeting system reached 95%. Saoirse's hand came up, steady, deliberate, and touched the authorization panel on the console in front of her. She said, Unit 1, Fire Control, cleared to engage, authorization Walsh 77 actual. And then she said, very quietly, almost to herself, let's see if this is enough. The first shot was aimed at the lead destroyer escort. I won't pretend I had any physical sensation of the firing. The targeting bay was in the station's interior, insulated from the direct experience of the weapon. What I felt was a momentary deepening of the structural vibration, the building release of months of stored energy in a fraction of a second, and then nothing. The systems showed a clean discharge. The capacitors dropped to zero. The recharging cycle began automatically. On the external sensor feed, Unit 1's barrel had produced a thermal signature that was off the scale of what our instruments usually measured. A brief, brilliant point of heat that lasted less than a second, and then vanished as the cooling systems engaged. And somewhere between Keller 9 and the Dominion fleet, a tungsten carbide cylinder, 60 centimeters long and 15 wide, was traveling at 15 kilometers per second toward a destination it would reach in. The targeting team was calculating flight time. At 15 km/s and the current distance to the Dominion fleet, it was on the order of hours. This was one of the central challenges of deep space kinetic weapons. The time of flight was enormous. You couldn't shoot at where a ship was. You shot at where it would be, based on its current trajectory and velocity, and you prayed that it didn't maneuver unexpectedly in between. This was the most imperfect part of the system. This was the thing that had kept people up at night during the planning phase. The Dominion fleet was traveling in a straight line on a predictable trajectory, decelerating at a known rate. All of that made the calculation tractable. But tractable and certain are not the same word. 4 hours after Unit 1's first shot, the monitoring buoys at 48 AU reported a detonation signature. The fire control team ran the data, checked it twice. One of the junior targeting officers, a young man named Reyes, who I later learned had barely slept in 48 hours, looked up from his station with an expression that I can only describe as someone who has just seen a theory become a fact. "Hit," he said, his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Direct hit. Destroyer escort Dominion designation." He checked the identifier Keth 7. Nobody cheered. That surprised me at the time. Later I understood it. We'd hit one destroyer, there were 4. And the Dominion fleet would now know they were under attack, and they would maneuver, and the targeting calculations would have to update, and the next shots would be harder. Saoirse said, "Reload status on Unit 1. "Charging," said the weapons officer. 12 minutes to 95%. "Prepare firing solution for Keth 4, Saoirse said, "and get me the status on Stormwall 3. Here's what the Dominion fleet did when Keth 7 disappeared. We know this from their communications, which we were intercepting with partial success throughout the engagement, and from the later account of Veth Kara himself, provided in his official report to the Council, a document that I have read more times than is probably healthy. Initially, they didn't know what had happened. This is crucial. A railgun projectile in space produces no flash, no explosion, no visible signal of any kind. The projectile itself is a small, dark cylinder traveling at velocity. Even if you happen to be looking directly at it, you would not see it coming. What you see is the effect. A ship that was there a moment ago, now producing an expanding debris field and thermal signature consistent with catastrophic internal structural failure. Veth Kara's first assumption was a drive failure. Keth 7's propulsion system catastrophically failing and detonating the ship from the inside. It happens with spacecraft, rarely, but it happens. The Dominion's first response was to broadcast a distress query to Keth 7, receive no response, and begin a damage assessment protocol. While they were assessing, Stormwall Unit 3, installed on a mining platform in the asteroid belt, further from the fleet but now with an updated firing solution based on the fleet's known position, and the trajectory adjustments our monitoring network had tracked, discharged. The shot from Unit 3 was aimed at Keth 12, the second of the destroyer escorts. It was a clean shot. The fleet was still traveling in a predictable pattern. The targeting solution was 97%. Keth 12 disappeared 7 hours after Keth 7. At this point, Vethkara knew it wasn't a drive failure. 2 destroyers, 2 catastrophic destructions, no warning, no visible weapons fire, no energy signature consistent with any weapon system the Dominion sensor package was configured to detect. The Velhari, Vethkara's species, had faster-than-light communication within their fleet network. The record of his transmissions to his ship captains in this period, recovered from the command cruiser's data core much later, is, I'll be honest, both disturbing and almost humanly comprehensible. He was, in the way that I've come to understand his communication style, scared. Not panicking, not abandoning command. But the specific careful quality of his communications in those hours, the double-checking of sensor data, the requests for confirmation and reconfirmation, the repeated queries about whether there were any known human energy weapon installations in the region. It reads, in translation, like a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit his model of the world, and is trying very hard to make it fit before he has to admit that his model might be wrong. He ordered the fleet to begin evasive maneuvering, a corkscrew pattern approach rather than the straight-line transit they'd been running. This was a reasonable tactical response to an ambiguous threat. It made the targeting calculations significantly harder. It also slowed them down, and it took them off their projected path in ways that our monitoring network tracked and fed to the targeting computers. The thing about evasive maneuvering when you don't know what you're evading is that your evasion pattern itself becomes predictable. A corkscrew is still a corkscrew. The variation is constrained by the corkscrew's parameters. The EDCA's targeting analysts had anticipated evasive maneuvering and had pre-calculated several pattern families with their associated trajectory projections. Keth 3, the third destroyer, disappeared 11 hours after Keth 12. Vethkara's transmission to the remaining fleet recorded and recovered later said, "All vessels, halt advance, halt advance. We are in an ambush, I repeat. We are in an ambush." He ordered the fleet to full stop, which in space is more complicated than it sounds. Full stop, for a fleet at interstellar approach velocity, means a long, fuel-expensive deceleration burn. The fleet came around, retrograde thrusters firing, slowing from approach velocity toward something closer to stationary relative to the sun. And while they were doing that, while they were effectively hanging in space at a known position for an extended period, while their drives roared against their own momentum, they were exactly where the targeting computers needed them to be. Unit 2, which had been holding its fire waiting for a better solution, discharged. Keth 11, the fourth and final destroyer escort, was hit in the forward section. Unlike the others, Keth 11 didn't immediately produce a debris field. It sustained massive structural damage and began venting, a slow catastrophic failure rather than an instantaneous one. We watched it on the sensor feed for 4 hours while it slowly came apart. By the time Keth 11 was gone, Vethkara had 4 destroyers, 8 troop transports, and 2 support ships that no longer had any operational escort capability. He had no idea what was shooting at him. He had no idea where the weapons were coming from. The deep space buoys that were feeding position data to our targeting systems were too small and too cold for his sensor packages to identify. He had no idea what the weapons were. He transmitted to Earth. "This is Admiral Vethkara of the Dominion's first expeditionary fleet to the government of Earth. I am requesting immediate communication with your command authority. We have suffered unexplained losses." He paused. Even in translation, you could hear him choosing the word. "Significant losses. I am requesting explanation and immediate cessation of." He paused again. "Cessation of whatever action is being taken against this fleet." He was asking us to stop. He was, carefully and formally and within the constraints of his rank and his culture and his pride, asking us to stop. Fleet Admiral Akefer's response, transmitted through the quantum relay, taking some minutes to arrive, was 6 words. "Turn your fleet around, Admiral Vethkara." He didn't turn around immediately. I want to be honest about that because it's important to the character of the man and the moment. He held position for 7 hours. 7 hours in which no further shots were fired. HFY had ordered a hold while the transmission exchange was ongoing, and during which the Dominion fleet sat in space and Vethkara apparently sat in his command center and thought very hard. His later report to the Council described those 7 hours as an extended tactical assessment period. People who have read the report closely tend to describe it as a man who was very good at his job, confronting the limits of everything he'd been told. At one point during those 7 hours, he transmitted a single-ship reconnaissance probe toward the inner system, a sensor platform, small and fast, that flew ahead of the fleet to get a closer look at what was between them and Earth. The probe's sensor data, when it was transmitted back to the fleet, showed them Keller 9. Showed them Unit 1. The probe was not equipped to fully analyze what it was looking at. Dominion sensor protocols were not designed to identify a weapon type that didn't exist in their threat database. But they could see a very large cylindrical structure attached to a space station. They could see that it was pointed at them. They could see that the station showed no energy signatures consistent with their known weapon types. Vethkara transmitted to his command staff, "What is that?" The response from his tactical officer was, according to the recovered record, "Unknown, possible asteroid deflection device." There was a pause in the record here. Then Vethkara said, "An asteroid deflection device." Another pause. "They told me," he said slowly, to what appears to have been nobody in particular, "that humans had primitive kinetic impact concepts." Another pause. "I wonder," he said, "how primitive." At hour 6 of the hold, Saoirse called me into her office. She was sitting at her desk, not the focused, functional stillness I'd been seeing for months, but a different kind of stillness, a more tired kind. "Sit down," she said. I sat. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, "because you're writing this down, and because," she paused, frayed-brayed, looking for words, "because I want there to be an accurate record of what this was." "Okay," I said. "It wasn't a military victory," she said. "Not the way that phrase usually means. We haven't won a battle. We haven't defeated an enemy. We've—" Another pause. "We've made a point, and the point needs to land." "Do you think it will?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. "When someone laughs at you," she said, "and then they find out that they were wrong to laugh, there's a moment, just a moment before they decide how to respond. And in that moment they're genuinely seeing you for the first time, not what they assumed you were, what you actually are." She paused. "That's the most dangerous moment, actually, because they could go either way. They could recalibrate and respect you. Or they could panic, and a panicking civilization with faster-than-light drives and energy weapons is a problem we don't want." "So what do?" I asked. "We give him time to make the right choice," she said, "and we don't fire again unless he makes the wrong one." At hour 7, Vethkara transmitted again. "I have reviewed the tactical situation," he said. "My fleet will withdraw to the outer system boundary, pending further consultation with the Council. I request assurance that no further action will be taken against vessels that are withdrawing." HFY's response, "You have our assurance, we'll be watching." I think about those 4 words a lot. We'll be watching, not a threat, not a promise of mercy, just a statement of fact. We see you now, we've always been watching. The Dominion fleet began its withdrawal at 2:14 hours the following morning. It was a long withdrawal, months at the velocities involved back to the heliopause. We tracked every ship every step of the way. No additional shots were fired. They left. The aftermath. This is the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into the heroic narrative, And I want to tell it because the heroic narrative, if you let it stand alone, misses the truth. In the weeks after the Dominion fleet's withdrawal, the Galactic Council went through what I can only describe as a collective existential moment. 11 civilizations that had built their framework of power on a stable hierarchy, known species, known capabilities, known positions in the order of things, had been confronted with evidence that their hierarchy had a gap in it. Not every member of the council responded badly. The 4 who had voted against Vethkara's proposal, the Shorath Cooperative, the Trellian Hegemony, and 2 others whose politics I won't try to summarize, moved quickly to open formal diplomatic channels with Earth. Genuine ones, not the patronizing, assessor-to-subject, protocols of the first contact period. Channels that implicitly acknowledged that the humans had something to say that was worth hearing. The Dominion's response was harder, and I won't pretend that the following years were peaceful, because they weren't. There were 3 more confrontations before the formal Treaty of Veloris was signed in 2194, none of them as dramatic as the Cassini Corridor incident, all of them carrying the risk of escalation. Diplomacy at that level is not a triumph and done proposition. It's slow, grinding, occasionally dangerous work, done by people who are very patient and very tired. But the laughter stopped. That's what I come back to always. The Council never laughed at humanity again after 2189. That's not a small thing. That's the sound of a relationship being rebuilt from a different foundation, and the foundation, for all its cost, was more honest. I spoke to Saoirse one last time, about a year ago, for this account. She'd retired from active command and was teaching at the Earth Defense Academy in Cape Town. She looked rested in a way I hadn't seen her look during the years I'd known her on Keller 9. I asked her what she thought the lesson of it all was. She thought for a long time. "Don't get laughed at," she said with a slight smile. "Seriously," I said. She was quiet again. "I think," she said, "the lesson is that capability and credibility are different things, and one doesn't automatically produce the other. We had the capability. We'd been building it for years. But the Council didn't give us credibility because they'd decided we didn't deserve it, and no amount of demonstrated capability changes that unless you make them look at the demonstration." She paused. "Vethkara came out there to receive our surrender, and he got a physics lesson instead. And the physics lesson, the vanishing destroyers, the weapon he couldn't see, the station at the edge of his reach, that made him look. Really look. And when he actually looked at us, he saw something different from what he'd been told." "What did he see?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "You'd have to ask him, but I think," she paused again, searching for it, "I think he saw that we were serious, that we had always been serious, that we'd just been waiting for the chance to show it." She looked out the window at the Cape Town skyline. "The laughter was never the insult, really," she said. "The insult was the assumption that we had nothing worth taking seriously, and that we fixed. I've been to Keller 9 twice since 2189. It's a different place now. Larger, better funded, with proper color-matched floor panels throughout. Unit 1 is still there, still operational, still maintained to the standard Saoirse established, tolerances that give a Swiss watchmaker anxiety. They added a small memorial panel near the observation viewport. Not triumphant, nobody wanted triumphant, just a list of names, the people who were on Keller 9 during the Cassini Corridor incident. Marcus is on it, Reyes is on it. Saoirse's name is at the top because she was in command. And below the list of names, a single line, which Saoirse herself wrote when they asked her for something to put there. "They didn't think we were capable. We showed them they were wrong. The rest is diplomacy." That's her, that sentence, precise, functional, getting to the point without fuss. The second time I visited, I stood at the viewport for a long time looking at Unit 1, at the barrel pointing into the dark, at the capacitor elements that would, if the order came, begin their slow pulse again. The Dominion's fleet had come out here laughing. The fleet had gone back diminished. Not destroyed, we hadn't tried to destroy them because Saoirse was right that destruction wasn't the point. The point was the demonstration. The point was making them look. Outside the viewport, the solar wind moved through the Kuiper belt in its invisible, patient way, carrying charged particles outward from a star that from this distance was just a bright point among many. Somewhere in the dark, one of Vethkara's destroyers was still out there, Keth 7, the first one, the one that had never known what hit it, a slowly dispersing field of debris that the physics of momentum was spreading across thousands of kilometers. An honest weapon, Saoirse had called it, nothing pretending, just mass and velocity and consequence. And somewhere further out, past the heliopause, the rest of the Galactic Council was watching Earth with different eyes. We had been something small in their model of the universe. We had been a footnote, a developmental curiosity, a species that was fascinating in their ambition and touching in their certainty. We had, without fanfare, without announcement, while they were laughing, built something that changed the equation. And now, finally, they were paying attention.